Well, hello, Southampton and beyond. Those of you watching in the city and wherever you may be tonight. I'm Adam Wright. I am the past president of the Southampton Neighborhood Association, and I have been asked to host this webinar format this evening to talk about Proposition R. One of the wonderful things about our neighborhood association is that we do look at questions like this that will affect the city and affect our neighborhood. And so we wanted to have a time to not just have a truncated discussion as part of our neighborhood association meeting, but really to have a longer discussion about this. This is something that we're going to vote on. And, so what does it mean if Proposition R passes? What does it mean if it fails? And why is it needed, or why would some say it is not needed? Those are all questions we are going to get into this evening. Before we begin, I do want to thank Tracy and Jules at Espresso Yourself Cafe here in the Southampton neighborhood. It is without a doubt my personal favorite coffee shop. If you ever come here and you're not sure what to get, I recommend the Happy Go Lucky, but everything here is delicious and they have options literally for everyone. In fact, they're trying to talk me into trying oat milk in my lattes now to be a little healthier, soy milk. So they do have something delicious for everyone. And if you want to come for lunch, go right on over to the other side to Sister's Sandwich Shop and enjoy some of the lunch offerings there as well. I also want to thank the SNA board for putting this together, and especially Tina Siebert, the president, and Donna Aga, who has been instrumental in coordinating all of the Zoom details for this evening. Tonight, we're joined by President Lewis Reed of the Board of Aldermen at City Hall. We've had President Reed out to our neighborhood association meetings many times in the past. It's always a pleasure to speak with President Reed, and he will be speaking as to the current process that just happened for redistricting in the city of St. Louis, and share some thoughts on what worked, what didn't work, and address the questions later on that we'll have for him. We're also joined this evening by Dr. Kathleen Farrell, a proud resident of the city of St. Louis, who is the and served as co-president of the League of Women Voters of Metro St. Louis from 2011 till 2017. And she is currently the leader of the St. Louis City League. She was a coalition member of the successful approval voting ballot initiative that resulted in the election of a mayor and alderpersons with a majority vote in April of 2001. And she is currently involved in the Reform St. Louis ballot initiative that has put Proposition R, it will be before us on the April ballot. So Dr. Farrell is with us this evening. I'd like to thank our panelists for being with us, and for all involved, a couple things to know. There is a chat function and I believe a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, depending on what type of device you're on. You can send us questions. We will be monitoring those throughout the evening. We may have some time at the end, I hope, to go through some of those questions. We've asked our guests this evening, both Dr. Farrell and President Reed, in the spirit of civility, and because we're on this Zoom format, which even after 2 years, we have not mastered in every sense, to allow, when one person is speaking, to allow that person to speak, and then each person will have a chance to go back and forth here as we have the conversation this evening. We'll be concluded by 8 o'clock, and then if there's something that you want to hear again, or you say, I wish I had a friend that saw this, I wish my friend would have seen this, we are going to post this on our website, technology permitting, and that'll go out to all of our members. So that's what's in store this evening. With that, I'm going to start to get out of the way here, and I would like to start with President Reed talking about, Proposition R is going to address several things. There's, I believe, 4 points to it, so I'm pulling up my notes here. But one of the key things is the idea of when we have redistricting of the wards in the city of St. Louis, who draws those lines and how does that process happen? Before we go into what the proposition proposes, President Reed, I would like to ask you to outline for us the process that just happened in late 2021 for the drawing of ward boundaries, especially as we've gone from 28 going now to 14 wards, and to ask the question if you would consider that successful. So with that, President Reed, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Adam. And I recommend trying the oat milk. It's good. I have it in my coffee all the time. It took me a while to get used to it, but it's good. So and thanks to the Southampton Neighborhood Association and not just for this forum tonight, but for all of the work that you all do to let your voices be heard when we're working on things in city government. So the process that we just had was hugely successful, especially when you measure it against other processes across the state. You don't have to go far, just go to St. Louis County where they have an independent commission that is assigned to drawing the map, and you see that it ended up landing in court and the judge ended up drawing it, which essentially took it out of the hands of all of the residents, all of you all. The process that we had, we ended up getting hundreds upon hundreds and hundreds of comments in, right, and suggestions in from people across the community, which helped us to draw the map. So the map was drawn essentially by all of you all. Southampton Neighborhood Association, you all can see firsthand how your voices impacted the changes in the lines in and around your neighborhood because you weighed in real heavy. You gave a reasonable answer to and why we should adjust the lines, and we responded and we adjusted the lines. This was teed up to be one of the most divisive redistricting processes in the history of our city, because we weren't just drawing a typical map that you draw every 10 years. We were drawing a map that essentially eliminated 50% of the elected officials at the Board of Aldermen. And we were able to do that without not even one no vote on the map. Right? We were able to do that in conjunction with neighborhoods just like yourself all across the city, organizations, like non-for-profits, 501c3s, and individuals from all across the city, right? All weighed in on the business interests and the like. And we were able to get it done much faster than nearly everybody in the state of Missouri. My last check was faster than anybody in the state of Missouri, but there may be a smaller municipality out there that matched what we got done. But none of them matched the fact that we did it under the extreme circumstances that we did it under, and didn't receive one vote in opposition to the map.
So to clarify, I just want to make sure that we're very clear about what that process was. A committee of the Board of Aldermen drew an initial map.
Oh, I'll go.
Sure.
I skipped. Sorry about it. So, when every 10 years, when the map is when we get the numbers from the Census Bureau, we draw a map. Right. That's what activates redistricting. It's drawn by the legislation committee at the Board of Aldermen. Right. So the legislation committee at the Board of Aldermen that we structured was a balanced committee, male, female, African American, white, right, all across the city, from every sector of the city, people who identify as progressives and non-progressives and so on and so forth. We made a very balanced committee, which helped to usher on the success. We also assured that everybody had a voice in the process. So it goes to committee. The committee held many meetings on the map, exhaustive meetings on the map. We released interim drawings of the map. And then when we came to what was close to a final map, we voted that map out of committee. It came back to the floor of the Board of Aldermen. And Adam, as you remember, it has to be read out loud 3 times on the floor. So it came out, we second read it, perfected it, and third reading passed it, and sent it over to the mayor's office for final signature.
All right, thank you, President Reed. Now, Dr. Farrell, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself here on Zoom. I would imagine that you and the organization that you work with did not just wake up one morning and say, you know what would be neat? We should come up with a new way to do this just for the sake of a new way of doing this, that your organization has expressed some concerns about the way that this was put together. So I would like to ask you, What are some of those concerns, and why do you feel that they need to be addressed?
Okay. Well, first of all, I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here tonight, and I appreciate President Reed being here as well. You'll probably figure out that we don't agree on a lot tonight, but I think we do agree on one thing, and President Reed and I have known each other a long time, and that is that we both love this city, and that we both work very hard to try to make this city better. So it's in the spirit that I'm going to make these remarks. You know, the bar wasn't very high in the city of St. Louis for this to be a better process if we look at past ones. But I would respectfully disagree with the fact that this was an open, transparent, and accessible process. And the first thing is that it was not an accessible process for all of St. Louis's residents. First of all, residents with disabilities did not have access, particularly those who are visibly challenged, to the maps in order to participate in this process. And that was a problem. If you didn't have a camera on your computer and have a computer, you could not participate in the Zoom public hearings. The public hearings did not allow questions and answers. And I think in terms of the public, I think it speaks a great deal to the League of Women Voters and other organizations who met President Reed and said this needs to be far more open. And we kept asking and asking and asking. And I think without those prods, we would not have had 6 max. We would not have had the participation. But the participation was limited for many people who were troubled by it. Second thing is that the process was not transparent. President Reed has described a process with the aldermen, which I did not see. And I must tell you that I attended every single legislation meeting which dealt with this subject, as well as every single whole board of aldermen meetings. First of all, let me say that the legislation committee was presented with a map from the president's office. As a matter of fact, there was only one license to the software that did this. And a number of those alder persons raised concerns about not having access to the software, not even being able to visualize for the first several maps on a street level what they were looking at. And they were troubled by that. The second thing is that we believe that this process should be open and transparent. There may have been meetings deep into the night, but the public could not see them. And I think that's really critical because that's where we saw criteria developed, I hope, and other things. Now, at least 2 of the alderpersons on that committee have expressed concerns about not really having a robust process and not really participating in that. I think one-on-one conversations with alderpersons and President Reed's office handing them a map is not exactly the kind of process that we want. So it wasn't accessible to folks, and we didn't have a transparent process where we really saw the sausage being made. We really saw this map being drawn, and that's really important. I commend the Southampton group. And if you all weren't as organized as you were on the short timeline that you had, you would not have been able to get these signatures and get your people involved. And I think the cry went out across the city. You've got to work hard to get involved in this process, and you all did. But how many of your other neighbors in St. Louis weren't as organized and couldn't get involved in this process? And I think we need to worry about them. The final thing is that I think that, you know, it's the League's position and other people who care about good government is that politicians shouldn't choose their voters. Their voters should choose their politicians. And it is a deep conflict of interest for alderpersons to draw their own maps. And I have to say, we could have started this process a lot earlier. We could have had serious conversations in the community about what they wanted. We could talk about crossing the Del Mar divide far more deeply than we did. We could talk about not only racial disparities, but economic disparities, and really talk about those things so that when we drew a map, we could talk about going forward with our city, but we couldn't. Now, in the past, President Reed has said, you know, it's illegal to start drawing maps early. I agree with him, it is. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the work that should be done before you draw the maps, to talk with these communities and to figure out how to overcome these kinds of problems. So I think that we worked very hard, I know the league did, to deal with the hand that we were dealt and to try to get the public involved. And we got a better map because we kept standing up and demanding it. I think we need something better. I think that something better is included in Prop R, and I'm going to talk about that later.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Farrell. President Reed, before we move on to our next part of the topic here, I do want to ask a follow-up question about the process that was used this time. And I think we all would recognize that one of the difficulties that the Board of Aldermen, and if it had not been the Board of Aldermen, any organization putting together a map this past go-around would have faced, is that due to the pandemic, the data available from the census did not come out as early as it normally would have, and that the current city charter requires that whatever map would be finalized, put forward, had to have been done by the end of the year. There was a hard deadline of December 31st.
Yeah.
So the question I'd like to ask about the process is, when was that process determined? And was there any consideration given to say to the public, listen, we're not exactly sure when we're going to get this data, but once we get this data, we do know things are going to have to kick into high gear. So here is how this is going to work. I'll be honest, at the time that this came out, I had stepped away from the Neighborhood Association board, so I was not following this as closely as I probably would have had I been involved. But I remember feeling a little shocked that the draft is released today and the first hearing is tomorrow when it was released. So I wonder if you could speak to that for just a quick minute here.
Oh, absolutely. So anybody that feels like they can plan to see where we would have been despite COVID, they would need a crystal ball. It was just, that's impossible to say, okay, this is what's going to happen based on what COVID. I mean, things, municipalities across the country were working the same as St. Louis in terms of trying to adjust their timing, and hopefully they can meet their chartered responsibility, right? Our chartered responsibility happened to be, first of the year. So we were able to get it done under that deadline. When we look at drawing a map, there are specific things that you really should do and specific things that you should not do if you do not want to find yourself in court. Even if it's a lawsuit that is meaningless, it can gain legs based on the process that you took. So the process that we took was a very measured process, a process that would keep us on sound legal footing moving forward. So when Kathleen was talking about utilizing economic numbers or drawing the maps based on the economic numbers within districts, right, or within areas, you can't do that because if we drew a map and said that, well, we drew this map because it encompasses 51% of the people who are below the poverty line, so that helps them, vote as a block. That is not a recognizable. That's not a recognizable demographic. In terms of meeting the one person, one vote standard, which is what we're required to do. That's not part of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is what we had to meet, the federal standard we had to meet. So when you look at what we did, you look at the transparency, we released drafts all the way along the way. We did that because that's the process we had put in place, and the process we took, right? No one said this is what you have to do. We continue to refine those drafts all the way along the way, so the community can weigh in on them along the way. Now, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback and say, well, no matter how good of a process it was, no matter how great it ended up, it could have been better.
I'm gonna interrupt you right here.
I think that's where we're at.
President Reed, I'm going to interrupt you here so we can move on to our next topic and stay on track this evening, but thank you for that. Dr. Farrell, I'd like to ask you then, we could spend a lot of time tonight dissecting the process that we went through this past time and other processes, but let's talk about moving forward. One of the things that was brought forward is this ballot initiative, Proposition R, which gained enough signatures to be placed on the ballot. We'll all be voting on it. We'll all hopefully be getting our little postcards in the mail if we haven't done so already. Here's your polling place and here's what's on the ballot. But we haven't really talked in depth about what Proposition R proposes yet. And so I would like to give you this opportunity to tell us the principles of Proposition R.
Okay. The principles of Proposition R are primarily threefold. The first one is that we want to prohibit alderpersons from taking official actions where they have a personal or financial conflict of interest related to that legislation being considered. So we want to make sure that the public knows if an alderperson has a conflict of interest by requiring disclosure statements to be posted on the city website. And some people have said, well, every public official has to fill out a 2-page form and turn it into the Missouri Ethics Commission. Two problems with that. Number one, that form does not include all of the kinds of conflicts of interest that need to be considered. And two, it's not accessible. In order to get that, you need to ask the Missouri Election Commission for it. And when you get it, I think you'll be very disappointed because you won't have very specific information. So if you were involved in a contract, if your relatives are involved in a contract, if your relatives manage city buildings, if your grandmother sits on the Urban League board and gets money from the city, there's all kinds of conflicts of interest. And if they do that, the public will know it. What we want is people to fill out these forms and turn them into the general counsel of the Board of Aldermen, whom they can consult and then post it on the website. Because we want to ensure that the public knows about it. And we want that to be very transparent. We want it to be easily accessible. We also want alderpersons to have to wait at least 1 year before becoming lobbyists, influencing city policy, bringing St. Louis in line with many other cities across the country. And finally, let me emphasize, it's not enough to say I have a conflict. We want to require that you recuse yourself from voting. And the present charter conflict of interest policy does not require that. We think that's very important. Secondly, we think actually that drawing your own lines is a serious conflict of interest, and that's why we have the second point. We want to give the power to draw ward boundary maps to an independent citizens commission composed of diverse, qualified citizen voters that must hold public meetings and that will keep neighborhoods together and be totally transparent. We want to prohibit lobbyists, alderpersons, and citizens with conflicts of interest from serving on it. And we want to have an oversight committee, which includes retired judges, which, by the way, are chosen by the Board of Aldermen, okay, who are qualified. And they will select the first 4 commission members who apply randomly from a pool of interested voters that the Board of Aldermen has already looked at and can strike, okay, names from it. And then that group will choose 5 more commission members so that we have a really balanced kind of thing. Now, I noticed a couple of questions in the question and answer. Adam, are you going to consider those later on? Or?
We will consider those later on, and those are some of
Okay.
the ones similar to some things I have in my notes.
Sure. And then we want them to draw these lines. We want those meetings to be public and open and transparent for everyone to see all parts of the deliberation, not just the final session of the legislation committee. And again, I sat in on all of those and I didn't really see, the real work that was being done. And to do that, now I've got to tell you that these have sprung up all across the country and they are working very well. The Brennan Center for Justice and the New York Times in January published reviews of how these public commissions were working. And what they concluded was that they worked extremely well and that people had trust in them as long as they had good, decent oversight. And that is what we have provided in Prop R. The third thing that we want to do is to prohibit the Board of Aldermen from overriding the will of the people about changing their election systems. So recently, there was a bill introduced, Bills 159 and 160, in the Board of Aldermen to repeal approval voting, which over 88,000 voters voted for in November of 2020. So we could have 20 Board of Alderpersons override over 88,000 votes. Now, we could talk about whether or not approval voting is good or bad, and that's irrelevant to this question. If it's bad, you need to go back to a vote of the people and have them vote, okay? But overriding the vote of the people is something that we want to require in the charter. If you're going to change the election laws and the way they vote, you need to go back to a vote of the people. By the way, I happen to think approval voting produced a much better election in this last election because we finally elected a mayor and alderpersons who had over 50% of the vote and they have a public mandate. We haven't done that in a while. So, but it doesn't matter. It's the principle of overriding the vote of the people. So those are the 3 big things. The last thing that I think President Reed will agree with me about is that we want to remove all the gendered language from the charter. We're not aldermen, and alderwomen. We're alderpersons, and so I see him, agree with me. So that's one thing we're going to agree on tonight, because that is a much more equitable way to run our city. So that is a brief description of Prop R. I'd be glad to get down into the weeds and answer anybody's question later on.
We'll have some opportunities for that here in just a short little bit. President Reed, I'd like to go to you now. I understand that you do not feel that Proposition R is necessary. I want to make sure that I understand that correct. I don't want to put words in your mouth on that. But if that is go ahead.
No, 100% is not necessary.
Okay, so then my question becomes, all of these things that Dr. Farrell has raised, I think to the average citizen of the city of St. Louis, we all would agree that avoiding conflict of interests with our elected leaders is a good thing. That if someone at the Board of Aldermen is making a financial gain from specific legislation that's being passed, I would want to know that, especially if that was my alderperson here. And then the idea of citizens drawing our map, obviously enough people support this that it is on the ballot. That all of these things at the surface seem like very reasonable, good things. But as you said, that you do not support this, 100% you do not support this. And so I'd like to ask why you do not support this.
Okay, let's first take the citizens drawing the map. When we, the assumption is that if an alderperson or an elected official is involved and the citizens aren't involved and the citizens aren't drawing the map, which is wholly and completely untrue. When you look at the city of St. Louis's map, all of you all citizens had a much bigger impact on the map than even myself. You look at where I am now. I'm in the Megan Green's ward, right? So all of my entire ward organization, all of my political allies and stuff, they're in other wards, right? I ended up, my house ended up in Megan Green's ward, and Megan Green is my alderperson, but that's the way the lines took us, right? You look in St. Louis County, Citizens Commission, ended up going to the judges, all the neighborhood organizations, all folks like yourself would have had zero voice in that. And that didn't just happen once, it happened over and over again in citizens commissions all across the country. So when you look at it, and I really truly invite you all just to do your own homework. Don't believe me, don't believe Kathleen, just do your own homework on these things and just Google it. Citizens commissions in the United States for redistricting, and you'll see tons of articles, and you'll see that they have not proven out to be a more efficient and effective way of drawing a map. And oftentimes it leaves the voters and the residents that preside in those areas completely out of the equation. The plan that Kathleen and her group put together is I think even worse than some of the commissions that we see across the country. And I don't say that, lightly. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the selection process and the oversight process, so a judge in St. Louis County can have a bigger voice than you, Adam, if you happen to have worked on a campaign somewhere, right? When you look at North St. Louis, the reason North St. Louis really had the aldermen and residents in North St. Louis, reason they really had a problem with it, they said, okay, how many retired judges live within our community? So it totally writes out that entire community in North St. Louis, right? And on. There are a whole bunch of things within to unpack just in that one line item alone. But let me get to some of the other things. When you look at conflicts of interest, I just had to file my paperwork, and I put a black marker over the password that they assigned me and everything with Missouri Ethics Commission, right? And that covers all those things that Kathleen talked about, whether my wife or a relative received any funding from any city agency, whether any of my kids received any funding from any city agencies, all those things are on there. But beyond that, locally, there are numerous ordinances that we've passed in the past that address conflicts of interest directly, right? That prohibit alder people from voting on pieces of legislation that would benefit them, right? And you have to file that paperwork with the clerk. The clerk has the paperwork, and you abstain from voting. You have to, right? And if you decide that you don't want to, you go to jail. I mean, those are the options. So I think prison time is enough of a deterrent for folks. But if you want to just look at a couple of ordinances, look at ordinance 70054, 66691, 69536, and I'll give you a list of others that you can look up that speak directly to what we have to adhere to in terms of conflicts of interest. To think that any modern legislative body in the United States of America lets their elected officials operate and vote on things that they will personally benefit from is just outrageous. But it is a good talking point. It's something that if the voters weren't educated on exactly what exists today, they would probably support that, because they say, yeah, they should, that's reasonable, that you should not be able to enrich yourself unjustly, right? But it was put there as a measure to motivate people to show up and vote on that proposition. So I think that the two things within that proposition that they really want to see, I think that they want to keep the approval voting intact. And I think they also want to get control over redistricting so they can begin to draw maps that would favor whatever group is helping fund their operation. As the group, what is it called?
So I'm gonna interrupt right here because there's a lot of points that have been brought up here. And
Okay.
so, Dr. Farrell, I want to go back. Actually, I want to say this first, and then we're going to go back to these. One of the things that happened actually just the other day, a friend of mine who lives in St. Louis County said to me, you know, you're about a year in now, coming up on a year. How have things been in the city with your new mayor? And I have to always say, you know, that when we have elected officials, there's always going to be something that I'm going to be happy about. There's always going to be something that I'm upset about. One of the things that was very positive, I thought, was that the mayor's office posted a list of all of the citizen commissions of the city of St. Louis, who's on them, when their terms expire or have expired, how you can apply to be on these commissions. And I thought, you know, in the age of the internet, how wonderful is this that we have this online? And so one of the questions that I want to ask tonight is, if Proposition R were to fail, you know, and this is going to be a point of disagreement between both of you, I understand. Is there a way that we could make the forms from the Missouri Ethics Commission more readily available through the city? You know, and I know that the Ethics Commission is going to be in charge of being the custodians of those records and the enforcers of the filing. But in an age where I can put a link in an email and say, check out this meme that I found that I think is just really funny, what would be the impact of that? I wonder if, Dr. Farrell, you could elaborate why you feel that those forms do not go far enough.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that all of the things that we want to do need to pass. So there is no not passing for me. Number one, we can't control or tell the Missouri Ethics Commission what to do. We can reform our charter, and we can require that those records be transparent. We also can control what information is required from them. We can't do that now with the Missouri Ethics Commission. Two, I respectfully disagree with President Reed. There is no recusal requirement in either city or other law. And I have read that section that he referred to many times. And it includes the conflict of interest principles, but it does not include the requirement that they be followed with a prohibition of voting on something that you have a conflict of interest with. Let me say one quick thing. I was the conflict of interest chair for St. Louis University. I spent a lot of time in the medical school, you know, making sure that people didn't have conflicts of interest. And you have to require that they recuse themselves. And that is really, really important, okay? So that is very simple about this in terms of conflict of interest. If we pass this, those forms can be put online, just like you said, those commissions and boards were put online. And people can all see them, and people can monitor them. And when there's a question or there's a problem, all of us can act. That cannot happen now. It cannot happen now, and that is key to keeping this going.
So would you say that under the current process, where you would have to go to the state to find that information, that you would like it to be easier? and perhaps more thorough in the posting of the information, that these are all of the potential conflicts of interest that are
Yeah.
listed on those forms. But then also, again, you're positing, if I understand correctly, that the ordinances and the charter of the city state that if you have a conflict of interest, you should not vote, but there is no absolute requirement that prohibits you from voting. Is that correct?
That is correct. And not only did we work on this ourselves, and I had a fair amount of expertise in this area, we also had legal experts. We had national experts who looked at this. We looked at the Brennan Center. We looked at other policies. And I could name you a number of cities and counties that have this recusal requirement, because people are realizing that letting elected officials decide from themselves isn't a good thing.
Okay.
So that's all that I can say about that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Farrell. President Reed, I want to continue the conversation. This is a good bridge point into our next topic here.
Hey, Adam,
Let me ask this question because I have a feeling it's going to give you a chance to respond to some of the points that have been brought up here. The question is, and I think we both, all three of us agree that all of these things, whether it's through Prop R or some other format, are laudable things. Having the public be able to see where a conflict of interest might be, having the public have a good deal of input into the drawing of the ward boundaries, and all of the points that are raised by Prop R. I think we all three agree that these are certainly good goals. It's how we go about them and how we go about achieving them that the differences lie. So I would ask, if not Prop R, whether it's because the voters would choose not to pass it, or had it not been brought up in this manner, but citizens would have raised these concerns. How do you feel we could better address these concerns? I mean, we use the example of the mayor's office posting the civil service commissions, or not civil service commissions, but those commissions on the city website. Is there a way that we could do what we do better to address the concerns brought up by Prop R?
Thanks, Adam. First, I'd like to draw everybody's attention to the chat box. I dropped a link in the chat box. If you want to know what's required in the state of Missouri, I think Kathleen would agree with me that St. Louis City is a child of the state, so we are governed by the state's our state constitution. We cannot operate outside of that. We only have the powers that the state gives us, right? So it is illegal under the state, in the state of Missouri, to do the things that Kathleen's already saying by any elected official. But if you click on that link, I want to make it really easy for people. If you click on that link and you scroll down to page 8, where it says understanding the law, you can look in there, and it has everything related to the state's provisions that we have to operate under as elected officials, right? But we even took ours even further in the city of St. Louis, and now require department heads to disclose any conflicts that they may have, any businesses that they're involved in. And the reason we did that, because imagine if the mayor of the city of St. Louis has a ton of department heads, and those department heads are investing in projects all around the city, and at the same time deciding if they're going to get a fair inspection or not, or if their plans are going to be approved or not. So now, what the Board of Aldermen, we did a number of years ago, we now require department heads to do that, right? So we're far beyond anything that Kathleen is talking about. When you look at this last election, and one of the things that is frustrating is when they say we finally elected a mayor by more than 50% of the vote. It's impossible for us not to have elected a mayor by more than 50% of the vote, and that is a slight against former Mayor Lyda Krewson. In the general election, Mayor Lyda Krewson won by more than 50%, by 50+% of the vote. Francis Slay, who I lost to, Francis Slay won by more than 50% of the vote, right? So you know, this notion that somehow people are being elected by you know, not receiving a majority of the vote is just obscene. Also, when you look at this last election where we had approval voting, we had fewer people vote in this last election than voted in the mayoral election in 2017 by a very large margin. So and get this, there were more registered voters and also fewer people voted in this last election than they voted in 2017. So approval voting seems to have done the opposite. And this is not the first time a mayor has been elected by 50 majority of the vote. To win an election, you have to be elected by a majority of the vote. A majority would be 50+% of the vote.
Due to time constraints, I'm going to pause here. I want to give Dr. Farrell just a very quick moment to respond to that. And Dr. Farrell, I wonder if specifically you could address approval voting and the idea of 50% of the people having voted for the mayor now to elect.
Yeah, a couple of quick points. Number one, we're a one-party town. And what that means is we're a Democratic town. The Democratic primary was the election. And I believe that President Reed would agree with that. And that's what I mean. If you have a Republican who got, you know, a couple of hundred votes against somebody who got tens of thousands of votes, that's the reason that the primary and then the runoff produces someone who has a mandate. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that President Reed has talked about the county and their redistricting. You know, that was a partisan commission. And that is not what we're doing here. And that is really important. I disagree with the figures that President Reed is giving about the 2017 mayoral election, and they're easy to look up. What we saw was more people voting in the general election because they knew it mattered. They voted in both elections, whereas before, everybody knew that the primary was the election, so why bother to go to the general election when it had already been decided among the Democratic Party. Finally, you know, if we want to change approval voting, let's go back to the people. Most people in polling done during the election said they were pleased with what happened. And they felt as if they really looked at candidates and we had a serious runoff. And that was for a number of offices, not just the mayor. So that's all I can say about that. I could talk about judges if you want, but
Sure. No, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. So I do want to
Right.
get to some of the questions that we received in advance.
Right.
And I'm going to do my best to consolidate some of these here. Dr. Farrell, I do want to start with you on this question. When we think about the process that we just went through for redistricting, and as I've shared earlier in this webinar, I remember the day the map, the initial public draft of the map was released. I was at work. I looked it up on the St. Louis on stltoday.com, and I was saddened to see that once again, Southampton neighborhood, which up until this point had been divided into 2 wards, actually 3 wards, mainly with Mackland Avenue as the dividing line between the 14th and the 16th, and then a little sliver cut out for the 23rd ward, was again going to be, by the first map that we saw, divided now this time north-south, either along Nottingham or Devonshire. And immediately, as we've said, several of us got together and said, let's make our voices heard on this. Had our voices not been heard, and I am very proud of the residents of Southampton that mobilized and said, we got to speak up for this because we know it's going to happen, but we've been doing this for a while. It'd be really nice to be in 1 ward. Had we been ignored, we would have had recourse then at the ballot box in the next election to say, if you voted for this, I'm so upset, you will not get my vote because you split us into 2 wards. With an independent citizens commission, And we've talked about the levels of scrutiny that, they're appointed, they're reviewed by the Board of Aldermen, et cetera. One main concern that I've heard from many people who have concerns about this citizens panel, where is the accountability if we're not happy with the map that they produce? I cannot vote out an independent citizens panel. So I would ask you to address that concern. I know it's one that's been brought up by some of our attendees and some who we've talked to before tonight's webinar.
Well, I think that there is good accountability built into the policy if you read it. Certainly citizens can appeal this commission. And the other thing that you can do, and it is if you do not believe that they produced a better map, and the evidence is overwhelming across the country where we've seen this, and I'd be happy to give you the examples that they do produce not only a better map, but people feel as if they participated. President Reed said we drew the map. We didn't. We were presented with the first map, and then the second map, and then the third map, etc. We didn't draw this map. So I think that the Public Commission has a very strong record across the country of being responsive to citizens and producing results, and people are happy with them.
I hate to interrupt, but due to time, I am going to, because one last question very quickly that's been asked. And I want to maybe make this two parts here. How would a citizen be chosen for this commission? Do they apply for it? Are they recommended by someone? And then do they receive any compensation for the work? Is it a volunteer position? If you could just very briefly answer that.
Yes. First of all, applications will be solicited from every voting citizen across the city. There are criteria. They must fill out a conflict of interest form. Each ward must be represented. And then that list goes to the Board of Aldermen, who has a right to strike an applicant. And then the Oversight Committee, which doesn't draw maps and doesn't make those kinds of decisions, draws at random the first 4 members. And then that group chooses together, those 4 people, chooses together 5 additional people from that pool to make sure we have a good and diverse group. Okay. No, they are not compensated, okay? But if you look at our other boards and commissions, I think that there are many people who would be willing to serve on such an important commission.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Farrell. President Reed, I want to ask you a very quick question here, and then we're going to move on to a closing statement from each of you. One criticism that I think we've heard discussed and of the process that we just went through is that there seemed to be a lot of there was a lack of knowledge of exactly how this process was going to work for most of the general public in terms of this is the date the map's going to be put out, and then these will be when we have the hearings. Again, not to criticize the past process, but to look forward to the next time we have to do this, which hopefully will not be as dramatic. We won't be going from 14 wards to 7 that I'm aware of. Yeah. How could we codify something now, if not through Prop R, to say that when the city goes through this process, here is the timeline of what will be done once we get the data from the Census Bureau? Could that be codified, and could we put that in place now so that 10 years from now it would have to be followed?
Absolutely, we could. We did do that when we introduced the bill to reduce the Board of Aldermen years ago, right? So we did part of it where we said that, the map would have to be passed by a certain date and so on and so forth, right? Generally speaking, when we receive the numbers from the Census Bureau, right? Let's assume for a second if we would have said, by in an ordinance that the map, the first draft of the map would have to be out by October 1st, right? any other year other than this past year, would have probably been possible, right? But it became very difficult because of the lag in the time it took us to get the numbers, because of the fight that the president was having over, if Hispanics should be counted and all this other stuff, right? And it just really cratered the whole thing and drew out the process. So, but yes, we could put some type of a structure together. Like we could say, well, the city should have X amount of hearings, right? Public hearings, right? If you look at, and the reason I draw on St. Louis County, because they're our easiest neighbor to draw on. While we were having all of these hearings, while we started as soon as we got the data and started getting information out to people. The Prop R people were beating on us, and St. Louis County had like no public hearings.
I do have to cut you off here for time. I apologize. I know I've cut both of you off at various points this evening, but it sounds like the answer is yes, we could put in place
absolutely
Prop R, something to say that from when the map is released, we will have this many hearings at these intervals.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
All right. Dr. Farrell, I want to give you the option. I'd like to give each of you 2.5 minutes to make a closing statement in support of your position this evening. And as President Reed went first, I'd like to give you the opportunity to either go first with a closing statement or go last. So which would you prefer?
I'd like to go last.
Okay, so President Reed, we're going to give you 2.5 minutes then to just make a closing statement here.
Okay, all right, no problem. But I think I started off, but that's, but I'm good with ending with going first. When we look at what Prop R does, we know that just through some of the voter data I just put into the chat box for you, just take a look at this stuff yourself. You'll see clearly that Prop R wasn't the cure-all to our election system. As a matter of fact, when you look at what they said at Dartmouth University did a grand test on approval voting. And what they concluded after trying to have a fair election for the student body president, they said that election system should never be used for any election of consequence. I would think a mayoral election in the city of St. Louis, president of the board of aldermen elected in the city of St. Louis, and your alder people's election in the city of St. Louis are elections of consequence. Prop R also says that somehow we're exempt from state law here in the city of St. Louis, and we can go vote on things and personally profit from it and go along our merry way. Well, that's not a reality that we live in. You will go to jail for that in the city of St. Louis, in the state of Missouri for doing that. So no, we don't do that. I just filed my ethics paperwork with the Missouri Ethics Commission. We have paperwork on file with the board's attorney. Anytime we've needed to abstain from a vote because of a conflict, if you work for a law firm and that law firm is handling something for that client on a board bill that's moving forward, you have to recuse yourself. And it happens regularly at the Board of Aldermen. And when you look at the unfairness in the process in terms of how people are selected, you say you want to keep aldermen from selecting, from drawing their own wards and aldermen out of the process and elected officials out of the process, but then you give the aldermen the power to select the people who go on the commission, which puts a barrier between them and the map so that then they can still direct the people who draw the map, but then they would have plausible deniability when the residents don't get their way, because they can say, well, it wasn't me, it was the commission. Well, it's the commission that you
President Reed, I have to stop you for time there. I'm sorry to interrupt. Dr. Farrell, we'll give you 2.5 minutes as well, starting now.
The bottom line is this: St. Louisans deserve a board of aldermen that can move our city forward at this important crossroads. And currently, laws require Board of Aldermen members to file conflict of interest disclosures with the Missouri Ethics Commission, and state law says that we should avoid them. But nowhere in state law does it say that we are required not to vote. That is the difference. Secondly, we want those conflicts of interest. We want your statement, President Reed, posted on the city website so that anybody can see it, so that I don't have to request a copy of it from the Missouri Ethics Commission, which is not easy, by the way. Okay. Secondly, we want public commissions to draw these boards. The Board of Aldermen doesn't pick them. They can strike someone who has applied. Okay. We're going to draw 4 people, and then the commission is going to choose 5 more. You don't pick them, and I don't think you really want to say that you'll get them to do your bidding. I think higher of you than that. But the bottom line is, and I haven't read the Dartmouth pieces, and I've read almost everything. The bottom line, and I do urge all of you to read the New York Times comprehensive summary of all of these, is that citizen boards work across the country. They work across the country, and they're working well. So I think this is something that we need to do. And finally, we want to prohibit the Board of Aldermen from overriding the will of the people. If you want to change an election system, ask us. Okay? And that's really important. We could debate approval voting, and approval voting is working. As a matter of fact, the National Association of Mathematicians uses it, which made me feel better because I think they know what they're doing. And other groups have used it as well. Again, we have a one-party town. That's the reason that the League of Women Voters thought it was a better election system for us. It doesn't work for everybody, but I think it worked for us.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Farrell. That time has expired. I know that with these 1-hour meetings, we could go on all night, and I think it's part of a larger conversation that needs to be had. I do want to thank President Reed, Dr. Kathleen Farrell, for being with us this evening to articulate your positions. I know I have a lot of things to consider as I decide how I will cast my ballot in the April election. But what does this mean for everyone else who's been watching tonight? Well, I would encourage you to follow up. Don't take anything I've said tonight. Don't think anything that our panelists have said tonight as 100% absolute truth without doing your own research as well. While we have no reason to doubt either of our panelists, in my opinion, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do our homework, and we should have a well-informed opinion when we go to the ballot box to cast our vote on this. So I would encourage you to do that. Second, make your voice heard. Perhaps you want to share your opinion with your neighbors. One of the ways you can do that is by coming to the Southampton Neighborhood Association General Meeting on Zoom next week, Wednesday, and perhaps this will be brought up. The association has not taken a position on Proposition R to this point, but it is certainly within the realm of possibility that the association could take a position, and the March membership meeting would be the chance to raise that question if you wanted to do this. I think one thing that all 3 of us have in common this evening, Dr. Farrell, President Reed, myself, is that we are all firm believers that this process will always be better when the citizens of the city of St. Louis engage in the process, whether that's electing our officials, our alderpersons, our executive offices, or talking about how the process itself should take shape and how it should be administered and implemented in the city. It's always better when we get involved. And so I want to thank them again for taking the time to be with us this evening. One final time, I'd like to thank the Southampton Neighborhood Association for asking me to be with you. It's not a perfect webinar, but I hope it was a good webinar for you. And we will be endeavoring to post this on southamptonstl.org. Thank you to President Tina Siebert and Treasurer Donna Aga for their work putting this together. And a big thank you to Espresso yourself right here at Macklin in Devonshire in the Southampton neighborhood, one of our member businesses of the association. We're very grateful for Tracy and Jules for opening their doors for Donna and I to be here tonight to host this webinar for you. And finally, thank you for being here. we've said all along that it's about you making the decisions, and your participation in this webinar is wonderful and a great step in making decisions that will affect all of us in the election in April. With that, I bid you all a good night. Stay safe, Southampton, and thank you for being with us.